Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman. He's a professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. He is the author of several books, and today we're going to talk about his most recent one, Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn. So, Dr. Zimmerman, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let me first ask you, because sometimes I guess that discussions surrounding free speech get a little bit entangled around what people really mean by free speech. So what is your definition of free speech?
Well, I think the simplest definition is free speech is the ideal and the value that allows you to express yourself and to make sense of the world and also to participate in politics. That is, to participate in the collective project of making sense of the world. To me, that's what free speech is.
Right, but does free speech apply in all domains of human activity, or is it just in particular contexts?
Well, look, no, no right is absolute, right? There's no right that applies in every single context. So in the United States, you can't call up the White House and say you're going to shoot the president. Is that a limit on your free speech? I suppose under some definitions. To take, I think, a more obvious contemporary example, I can't say to one of my students, I really like the sweater you're wearing, and if you wear it next Tuesday, I'll give you an A, right? Is that a limit on my free speech? Yes, of course it is. So no speech is absolute, but it seems to me that if anyone, including the state, wants to limit it, what they need to do is to show very real, absolute, and material dangers that would obtain from it. That should be the burden. The burden should never be on the speaker to show why she or he should be allowed to speak. The burden should always be on the state to show why they shouldn't.
Okay, so so since you're not then a free speech absolutist, as some people are, what would you say are some of the limitations to free speech that you consider acceptable? I mean, perhaps this is
Well,
too broad of a question, but I don't know if you want to focus on particular domains or not.
look, I just mentioned a few of them. Sexual harassment, right? Most forms of sexual harassment are not physical, they're verbal, right? Um, they are speech, right? And I don't think they should be legal. They happen. I'm deeply aware of that, but I think that they should be interdicted. And then secondly, the incitement to violence, but Ricardo, let me be very clear about that. I think the American courts have gotten that actually right, which is that if you want to say that somebody incited violence, you have to show an immediate and absolute threat of violence. Like it can't be imagined, right? It has to be immediate and material. So to take a very recent example, let's think about Donald Trump's speech before the insurrection at the Capitol. Let me be very transparent about this. I supported Trump's impeachment both times, including the second time, but I would not have voted for the first article of impeachment, which was that he incited the riot. I think there were many other legitimate reasons to impeach him, including the fact that, by the way, when the riot started, he didn't do anything. And his job is to protect the public. So I think that was impeachable in its own right. But did he incite the riot by saying, you've got to defend your country? I believe not. And I think if you go down that road, the next time there's a Black Lives Matter protest and somebody burns a police car, you have to be ready for critics to say, well, an hour before this guy said, fight the pigs. Obviously, he incited the violence against the police. There is no obviously there. So, of course, all rights are limited, including free speech rights. But if you want to show that, if you want to claim that a certain speech incited violence, You have to have absolute and direct evidence of that.
Right. But do you think that there are any particular ways free speech is under threat nowadays?
Oh, sure. It's under threat from every corner. And I think the reason is that democracy is so tenuous now. And free speech and democracy are deeply, deeply connected. I think all of our democracies, including the American democracy, have performed very poorly recently in all kinds of ways. Think about the COVID example we were talking about at the beginning before we started taping. And I think what that means is people have less faith in the system and therefore less faith in each other. And that's why free speech is under challenge, right? If we believe in our democracy, we believe that all of us should be able to participate in it. And all of us should be able to have our say, even if it's crazy or awful or whacked. And I think that on every side of the political spectrum, and I would also say across nations, unfortunately, we are losing that faith. So that's why free speech is under challenge. So in the United States, the challenges come from both the left and the right. So, if you look at college campuses, which are dominated by the left, they're passing these speech codes saying, you can't, say anything that's going to like harm or microaggress or trigger somebody. And then on the right, you have state legislatures that are banning schools from discussing race and racism. And at the same time, complaining about cancel culture. Like, huh? So it's happening everywhere. And it's happening across the political spectrum. And I think it's a function of our lack of faith in our democracy and in ourselves.
So I guess that's a very important thing to say because then free speech is not really a partisan issue, as some people tend to suggest. Like, for example, nowadays we hear very much people on the right complaining about leftists and their attacks on free speech, but it's not really that people on the right are not, are not guilty of it as well.
Their hands are not clean, as the lawyers say. No, of course it's not a partisan issue, but to your point, unfortunately, especially at college campuses, it's become one. So, Ricardo, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I've never voted for a Republican in my life. But because I'm zealous about defending free speech, many people on my own campus think I'm a conservative or a Republican. And this is absurd. And I should tell you, ahistorical. I'm a historian. And the reason that I wrote my book, Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn, is to try to encourage my students, and by the way, my daughters, who are 28 and 25, to look backwards in time. Like, can we please leave our moment for just a moment? And if we do that, if we look backwards in time, what we see in the American context is that free speech has been the linchpin of every movement for social justice. Anti-slavery, civil rights, women's suffrage, gay rights, and all the founders of those movements were zealots about free speech, warriors for free speech. Why? Because, Ricardo, if you took away their speech, they would be unable to critique the oppression that they were experiencing. So it's only in our own moment that like free speech and social justice have been put into tension. There is no tension between them. And it's only because we don't look backwards. It's only because we're caught in this presentist moment that we can't see that.
Okay, but for example, when it comes to the left and particularly in Europe, I don't know about the United States, but I imagine not so much there. There have been some laws passed, that we can say go against free speech when it comes to saying, for example, racist, sexist,
Right.
and things like that.
Right.
I was just wondering, when it comes to those kinds of things, those kinds of statements that can be considered racist, sexist, and so on, what's the harm for society in terms of, prohibiting that kind of speech?
Well, the harm is that what's racist or sexist is often in the eye of the beholder. We disagree about what is racist and sexist, and I don't want a politician deciding what that is. I mean, when Trump was still president, my left-wing students would say we need to restrict racist and sexist speech. And I would say, okay, who do you want doing that? Who do you want making that decision? Trump? Do you want him deciding what's racist or sexist? It's not, Ricardo, it's not like people walk around with like a big R or a big S on their chest. You know, I am racist, I am sexist. Um, what's racist and what's sexist is itself a subject of debate. Let me give you an example, right? A very contested question in our country is affirmative action. So should, for example, universities give, let's say, a plus factor, as we would call it, like a boost to minorities, especially those who have suffered historic discrimination. And again, for the sake of transparency, let me tell you that I'm a supporter of affirmative action, like most people on the left. But here's the problem. People who are against affirmative action at the university are afraid to say so. You know why? Because they're afraid they'll be called racist. Because if you oppose affirmative action, you're racist. Now, note, I don't believe that. I don't think everyone who opposes affirmative action is racist. But you know what? Some people are. David Duke is the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and he's a racist, and he opposes affirmative action. Some people that oppose affirmative action are racist. But I don't want a university or a government defining racism in a way that, say, if you oppose affirmative action, you can't do that because it's going to be construed as racist. I think that's not good even for affirmative action, which could only benefit from a real debate. But once you allow the state to decree what's racist or sexist or homophobic, you're not going to be able to have those dialogues.
So your problem is basically with government decrees. So, for example, if limitations to free speech come from culture?
Well, look, I mean, I think that they come from both places. Those are different kinds of threats. Mm-hmm. And I would say, you know, at the university level, one of the things that we've discovered is a lot of it is cultural in the sense that there aren't ironclad rules against certain sort of speech. But when you interview students, majorities of them say that they're afraid to express their opinion. All right, especially in class. That's not because there's some jackbooted thug that's going to arrest them if they say the wrong thing. It's because of what you're calling the culture. And that's a huge problem, right? We should, especially in our educational institutions, we should have cultures that encourage people to say what they think, not discourage people to say what they think. That is a cultural problem. And as an educator, I'll tell you, it inhibits education. It inhibits learning. After Trump was elected, there were very few people at Penn who supported Trump. But some of them came out, as it were, to me in my office. And I kept saying to them, look, would you tell the class about this? Because I think we could all learn by hearing from somebody who voted for Trump. And they were like, are you kidding, man? Like, do you know how much shit I would take, like on social media and everything else? So tell me how that could be good for education. It's terrible for education. Education is supposed to expose us to things that are not us. So if almost everybody voted for Hillary, you should be exposed to people that voted for Trump so you can understand them. And that's what is not happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I mentioned culture, I was thinking perhaps more about instances where, for example, certain things that, I don't know, 50 years ago, 100 years ago would be considered, I mean, it wouldn't be a problem for people to express those ideas about, for example, women, minorities, and so on, nowadays are culturally discouraged. I
right.
mean,
and look, that's, you know, that's fine if what we're talking about is, say, calling gay people the F word or calling black people the N word. Mm-hmm. I don't think that should be illegal. But I do think there should be strong social sanctions against it. And you know what? There are, right? If a politician got in front of a bunch of microphones and said those words, there would be serious consequences, right? I don't think they should be illegal, but I think they should be tabooed, and they are. right? The problem is with what I call the taboo meld, right? Making more and more things tabooed, right? Calling gay people the F word should be taboo. But just to give you an example, right? We're still debating in our society whether gay people should be able to marry each other. I think in a classroom, you should be able to argue against that. Again, let me be totally transparent. I'm a supporter of marriage equality. I find the other position reprehensible. In my classroom, you're not allowed to call gay people the F word. But you are allowed, and you should be allowed, to argue that marriage should just be between a man and a woman. To be clear, that is not my belief. I find it a reprehensible belief, but it's shared by millions of people in this country, and we need to air it out, as we say in America, right? Nobody will get smarter if the people who oppose marriage equality are biting their tongues. Nobody will get smarter. The only way to get smarter is to hear them out and to try to understand them in a reasonable and civil way, which means not calling gay people the F word.
Right. I mean, I asked you that just because it seems to me that some people have the sort of simplistic idea that free speech entails that you're entitled to say whatever you want, and ideally without any consequences. I mean, I'm not simply talking about legal consequences, but
Yes.
also social consequences.
And look, I don't think that any action is without consequence, or should be, right? If, to return to our example, like a politician called people the N-word in front of microphones, I think they would face consequences, and to your point, they should, right? I don't think that you should be able to say anything you want without consequences. Look, another way of looking at this, Ricardo, is the consequences, as you're calling them, are themselves a form of free speech. So this is what I say to my students. If you don't like hate speech, use your free speech to criticize hate speech. Criticizing hate speech is itself a form of free speech. And I would argue a very important form.
Right. I mean, so with all in that, with all of that in mind, for example, when it comes to universities and campuses, so for example, I talk with lots of scientists and I read their papers and so on, and it seems to me that, for example, there are some ways of limited ways of suppressing certain forms of free speech that can be helpful in terms of, I mean, progressing or forwarding knowledge. So, for example, in a scientific paper, it's not that you're allowed to say whatever you want and in whatever way you want, but you have to follow certain rules. I mean, do you get what I'm saying? So isn't that some way of, I mean, developing rules in terms of what you can
Yes,
say
right.
and how you can say it that
Right.
helps forwarding
Society is not
knowledge?
a scientific paper, right? That is,
Okay.
scientists have a culture, to use your term, and they also have a set of procedures that they've evolved for determining what's science and what isn't, and what's true and what isn't. Very powerful procedures, okay? Look, Ricardo, no one has a right to publish a paper in Nature, right? You have a
Right.
right, and I think you should have a right, to say that COVID is a hoax, right? Out in the public square. But nobody has a right to publish that in Nature, right? Or in Scientific American. Those journals have their own standards, and they have a right to maintain those standards. And it's not censoring anybody to say they can't publish in Scientific American. I've never published in Scientific American, but they haven't censored me, right? I just don't have interesting things to say that they would want to publish. So I think it's really important to make this distinction, right? That is, no one has a right to get a paper into print. They have a right to raise their voice. And those are two very different things.
Right, I understand. But just to pick on your COVID example, I mean, someone shouting on the streets that COVID is a hoax. I
right.
mean, doesn't that have or can have negative consequences in terms of how people
Well, it
will deal?
does.
Yeah,
Huge ones. And Ricardo, let me come clean here. My wife is an infectious disease physician. Her
right.
specialty is infection control.
Yeah.
So since March of 2020, she has been working for 18 hours a day trying to control the spread of COVID. Okay? There
Hmm.
are many reasons why in the United States we've done a bad job of preventing the spread of COVID. But one of them, not the only one, is the kind of misinformation that we're talking about. All
Hmm.
right. So what do you do about that?
Right.
I would suggest that what you do is you use your own speech, the speech of the government, the speech of scientists, to persuade people not to censor them. And let me give you a very good example of the problem here.
Hmm.
You may recall that right after COVID began, already on the internet, there were rumors that it had been hatched in a lab in Wuhan.
Right.
Facebook and then Twitter and these other organizations, which are not state organizations, they're private ones, and we can get to that later.
Hmm.
They included that in their misinformation and hate speech category. And
Hmm.
whenever they saw it, they blocked it.
Right.
Well, a couple weeks ago, Joe Biden appointed a commission to investigate whether it happened, suggesting that, well, there's a chance. Now, please don't misinterpret me. I'm not saying it
Mm.
was hatched in a lab, and I still believe that that's rather unlikely. But
Right.
it is possible, possible enough that the President of the United States appointed a commission to investigate it. And just a year ago, the internet was blocking people that said that. I'm not comfortable with that because, again, that prevents us from learning. We should know whether this was hatched in a lab in Wuhan, and we will not know if we erect rules against discussing that.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that, about private companies. And I mean, for example, when you use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or whatever, you're basically using their services. So,
Correct.
I mean, to what extent do you think it's legitimate for them to control the kinds of speech people have there?
I'm very uncomfortable with it. I think it goes to very bad places. And that Wuhan example is a really good one. Look, I think they honestly believe that this was misinformation. I'm not saying they're liars. What I'm saying is they're fallible. And that's different, right? They believe that. And I think at the time I probably believed that because that's what all my friends were saying. Oh, did you hear this ridiculous anti Asian slur about this being made in a lab? That's so racist and stupid. That shouldn't even be on the internet. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg making that call any more than I want Donald Trump or Joe Biden making that call. That's your call and my call. All right. And these guys should not be sitting on thrones saying, oh no, that's too dangerous for Ricardo and John to hear. They're rather delicate flowers, and we have to protect them because we know what's best for them. We know what is true with a capital T. So let's just tell it. And let's get rid of all the capital F falsehoods. And then everything will be great for Ricardo and John. This seems like a fantasy to me, and again, a deeply cynical and undemocratic one. Democracy is not just a system of government, it's a system of faith. That's what it is, a faith in our ability to govern ourselves. If what you think is that Mark Zuckerberg or Joe Biden should take this stuff down from the internet, you have lost your faith in democracy. I haven't lost my faith in it yet. We can do this, right? Without some great king or queen telling us what's right or wrong.
Yeah, but I was just wondering, doesn't it make any difference that these companies are private in terms of the legitimacy of their actions?
Well, look, I mean, legitimacy, that's complicated.
Okay.
In the United States context, it absolutely affects the legality of it. So let's be clear. Mark Zuckerberg does have the right to take that Wuhan stuff down from his site. And the reason is it's his site,
Right.
right? He does have the right to do that. But at the same time, it has become a public square. Even Zuckerberg says that, And so while I don't contest his legal right to take that down, I do contest the ethics and the propriety of it. That's different. And I'm the sort of Democrat that thinks the answer to the Facebook problem is not for, Zuckerberg to create a new set of rules. It's to make Facebook smaller, which, by the way, we do have the power to do, right? There's a long history of antitrust regulation in this country, in which the government has broken up giant companies on the theory that the public interest will be served better by smaller units than larger ones. And that's the kind of regulation I'd like to see of organizations like Facebook, like not regulations of their content, regulations of their size.
Right. So we've been talking about a lot about politics and universities, for example. What about free speech in the arts? Do you think that it also plays an important role there?
A huge role. And this is something I put a huge emphasis on with my students, because if they favor censorship of every kind, they have to know what was censored in the past. James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, D.H. Lawrence. My father couldn't read Lady Chatterley's Lover when he was a kid growing up, in the 40s and 50s. There were like some samizdat, some underground copies that circulated. But it was illegal in most parts of the United States. And in fact, it's one of my favorite quotes, federal customs officers were, empowered to prevent these books from coming in. And somebody asked an inspector, what's a classic? Like, what's a classic piece of literature? And he said, a classic is a dirty book that somebody is trying to get by me. That's what a classic is. And so, I think the history here is hugely important, because the arts have always existed to challenge the status quo. And therefore, the arts have always been subject to censors. Think of the history of film, which was radically censored for most of this time. So the arts can't live without free speech. And it's always sad to me when I meet a student in the arts who is carrying water for these censorship ideas. I'm like, your field wouldn't even exist if not for free speech. Free speech is what has allowed the arts to flourish.
So, with all of that in mind, we can say that there are clearly historical precedents of threats to free speech in all different domains, right?
Indeed. And that's why I wrote my book, is I just want to remind people of that so they're vigilant about protecting, right, those freedoms. They don't exist in the sky, right? They don't exist in some mosaic tablet. They exist in us. And if we turn our backs on them, they go away, right? They're social norms and practices. And they've been observed in the breach. What I mean by that is we violated them across our history. And that's the history we have to remember, right? So that we don't repeat it. To your point about kind of cultural ideas, this isn't just a legal matter. It really is a moral, almost a religious one to me. So Learned Hand, who was a very famous jurist in the 20th century, he gave a speech in 1944 called The Spirit of Liberty, in which he said, look, the spirit of liberty is a spirit that lives in the hearts, he said, of women and men, which is an interesting phrase in 1944, because most people would have just said in the hearts of men. And he said, if it dies there, no law and no constitution is going to save it. And this is a federal judge talking, right? And he's like, look, don't look to me, man, right? I have a role, okay? But this is something in you. And if it leaves you, I can't help you. It's a spirit, and we've got to preserve that.
So What would you say to try to convince people that are part of the general public and not people that are particularly interested in politics or science or academia and so on, uh, that they should care about free speech?
Well, in our book, we give four reasons,
Okay.
and just very briefly, what they are is the first one is free speech allows you to criticize your leaders, especially in wartime. The second one is free speech allows oppressed minorities, including racial and gender and sexual minorities, to challenge their oppression. Number three is free speech allows you to create and consume the art and literature that you would like. And number four, free speech allows teachers and students to express themselves at school. Now, again, let me be clear, Ricardo. This hasn't always happened, right? That's the point. I mean, what I say is should allow, right? Or in principle allows. Often it hasn't, and that's exactly the point, right? Is we have to remind ourselves of all the time it hasn't. But to take your question, I don't know which of these will be most persuasive to, the audience you're imagining. It probably depends on their sensibility and their politics. But one thing that I would say is, if you support censoring somebody else, watch out, dude, because they're going to come and censor you. I think the most naive idea is that we could find the bad guy, say, look, there he is, let's censor him. And then it's not somehow going to boomerang back on you. But of course it is, because eventually his team is going to win the election, right? And he's going to censor you. So give up this childish fantasy that we've got the devil by the tail and let's just censor him. Because sooner or later, somebody's going to say, you're the devil, all right? They're going to grab you by the tail, and then you're gonna be censored.
Right. So I would just like to ask you one or two more questions that are more philosophical in nature.
Sure.
So I've had Dr. Stanley Fish on the show, and he
Yeah.
has an entire book about how free speech doesn't really exist. So I mean, are you aware of it, and what would be your reply to him?
Yeah, I look, I have a lot of respect for Stanley Fish. I think he's a brilliant guy. And I think that free speech does exist. And the way you know that is by looking at history and the way that it has powered movements for change and social justice. I don't think Stanley denies that. I think his argument is kind of more philosophical as I understand it. I don't think
Right.
he would contest the idea that, say, gay rights depended on free speech, right? Because gays couldn't even find each other, right,
Right.
without free speech and without publications that they used to connect with each other. I don't think Fish would deny any of that. If his point is that it doesn't exist as some sort of great abstraction in the sky, I take that point, and I agree with that, you know. But it does exist in our material lives, and most of all in our history, in our historical lives. And no matter what you think about it in the abstract, you've got to study that history, right? Stuff happened, and we know it, right? So Vietnam was the first war that in the United States you could criticize legally. That's the first war, and I was alive during that war. So this stuff is incredibly recent. And if you forget it, the next time there's a war, somebody is going to prevent you from criticizing it. So no matter what you think about free speech in the abstract, if you think we can govern ourselves, and if you think that whether the United States should be at war should be up to the people, not to the generals, you have to support free speech.
Okay, great. So let's end on that note. The book is again Free Speech, Why You Should Give a Damn. Dr. Zimmerman, where can people find you on the internet?
Well, they can just go to the University of Pennsylvania homepage and they'll see, type in my name and they'll see it. And they can also, of course, go to Amazon to get our free speech book. And Jeff Bezos will send a drone to your home and deliver it quite rapidly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Zimmerman, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you, Ricardo. It was fun.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. So, to keep the channel sustainable and to keep it running, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page. You have all sorts of benefits there, and any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnold Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Lenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Meira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, my producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sérgio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Brett, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.